All right, so welcome back to The Young Idealist in my ongoing series on classical German philosophy and post-Kantian thought. And today we're flying over to France to discuss the thinker Simone Weil with Kathryn Lawson, who's a faculty fellow in philosophy and humanities at the University of King's College in Halifax, Canada. She's lectured in philosophy at Carleton University in Ottawa and Queen's University in Kingston and Western University in London. Dr. Lawson's first book, Ecological Ethics and the Philosophy of Simone Weil, Decreation for an Anthropocene, is with Routledge's Environmental Ethics series, and she's also a co-editor of a collection on the philosophy of Hannah Arendt and Simone Weil, Unprecedented Conversations with Bloomsbury. Her philosophical work has been published in academic books and peer-reviewed journals. She's been so kind to come and join and be a part of this series, so I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Lawson. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's absolutely my pleasure to be here.
So perhaps you could begin by introducing who Simone Weil was and why you think her philosophy remains important for today.
Yes. So Simone Weil is, as you mentioned, she's French. She's a Parisian philosopher. She's born in 1909 in Paris. And she has this incredibly unique ethical system for the tumultuous times that she's living in. So she has this very exciting life. She dies early. She dies at the age of 34. And in this brief life, she has this incredible philosophy. I would say there's probably four major reasons that Weil's philosophy is so important for us today. The first one being her ethics, and the ethics that are based on the oppressed. There is this really strong call to action for us to pay attention to those who are being marginalized. And I think that this ethics is very, very much at the forefront of what we need in the world today. I'd also say her religious thought is really important because she has this, I would say, universalist concept of religion, where she's really drawing on all different forms of religious practices, of mythology, of folklore, in order to understand, and also of Greek tragedy and theater, and all of these ways that we can really understand kind of our connection to something more, something universal, something higher. And I think that this is, in our globalized world, this is really important to have. Um, that kind of leads into her reading of Plato, which I think is, well, in my perhaps biased opinion, the best reading of Plato. But she really gives Plato this space where we don't have a rejection of the material world, where we can really embrace a lot of the ideas of the ethical good and the forms without negating the physical world. And this is going to be really important for Weil. And I think it's really important for those of us who love the Western philosophical tradition, because Plato oftentimes sits at the heart of that tradition, and we're all in conversation with Plato. So trying to think through what that conversation looks like, how it can be ethical, that's something that Weil really gives us. She gives us alternate readings to Plato in that way. And then finally, one of my favorite quotes for Weil, especially when I was trying to think through how to use Weil in ecological ethics, what is that you could not ask to have been born at a better time than this, when everything is lost. And she has in her thought this tragic optimism, or it's also David McClellan calls it a utopian pessimism. So she allows us to see the reality of the world around us, and to still hope, to still love, most importantly, to still act. And again, I think ecologically, politically. We really need a thinker like Weil to help us through the times that we are in right now. I'd also say something to me that's really important for particularly academics to think through Weil is how much she has been misread and misunderstood. Come to think of Weil as almost a Rorschach test for what it is that people are angry about in the world, and they like to put that onto Weil. So her concept, for example, of decreation is often misunderstood as kind of a self-destruction. And then that can lead into a sense of hatred of the body, anorexia, these types of things. There's also, she has this wonderful inclusive pedagogy that can lead people into thinking she has this foolish ideology that doesn't understand the limitations of class, that doesn't understand, and she really wants to allow education to be for everyone. She also, when she talks about something like the dark night of the soul, people, which again, very common in a lot of religious texts. However, when people read that in Weil, they think about suicidal ideation. And it is, she's reduced to sexuality, to gender, to body over and over again. And this is, I would say, not as common in academic circles. It still, unfortunately, does happen in academic circles. But it's very common in kind of more popular uptake of her work. So this happens, there's been, even within the last year, articles, for example, in the New Yorker, that really misread her work. And I think it's really important for us to kind of set the record straight, to try to understand what she's saying and to forefront her philosophy, which is really the most exciting thing about her.
And this is why you're here today, to kind of help us go through her life and thought. As I started to focus on women philosophers and go through this great series, I knew that I needed someone special to kind of bring us through Vey, because as you so nicely brought together all of these kind of misreadings that are kind of baggage around her work. And so far, you're doing such a great job. I'm learning so much. I don't know Vey that well. I know Gravity and Grace. Um, but so far, this is wonderful, and I can see the kind of passion in your eyes as you're speaking about vase. So um, it's already super exciting for me as well too. Could you briefly outline Vey's biography? Now, I always say this to all of my guests. It doesn't have to be super exhaustive. It can just perhaps, discuss maybe the main events that matter to her as a thinker.
Yes. So she has this, as I said, very short life and very exciting life. Now, she obviously lived in very tumultuous times. So she's born, as I said, 1909 in Paris. And then she dies in 1943 in Ashford, Kent, in the UK. So as we know, there are two world wars that happened during that time. It is a incredibly difficult time to be alive. So she's born into an upper middle class assimilated Jewish family. So she does not practice Judaism. Her family really considers themselves to be Parisians. That's what they are. I would say her relationship with her Jewish heritage is problematic in a lot of ways, in how she kind of sees herself and engages with the Jewish faith. She studies philosophy. She studies under Emile Chartier, who is kind of commonly referred to as Hélène in 1925. So she's one of the first women to attend the École Normale in Paris. And so she attends at the same time as all our existentialist thinkers. So she's there with Simone de Beauvoir, she's there with Jean-Paul Sartre. And in 1930s, she graduates. During this time, she really takes a lot of activism on. So her fellow students talk about, like, you can't even bump into her without having to sign a petition or getting in an argument about workers' rights. So she's the administration would sometimes refer to her as the Red Virgin. They would also as the categorical imperative in skirts, because she just was this absolute embodiment of ethics. She lived her ethics as thoroughly as she could, to the extent when she was 5 years old, she decided she wasn't going to have sugar anymore because soldiers didn't have the rations to have sugar, so she wasn't going to have them. Yeah, so she really, throughout her life, chose to live this way. She graduated and she had work. She would give away any extra wages beyond what the workers in factories around her were making. She had this very, very strong sense of ethics. And as we get into her ethics and talking about the demands of them, they're staggering, and she feels she never lives up to them, but she really does her best to live up to them. It's let's say inspiring, inspiring to see how much she really tries to live up to these things. She also, so she writes her dissertation on Descartes, and who's kind of ever present, I suppose, at that time in school. And when she graduates, she applies for teaching positions, hoping to get positions in larger cities. She's kind of sent off to more rural colleges to teach there. And a major part of that is she's so frustrating to the administration with the amount of kind of social justice activism that she's always doing. So like, let's just push her off over here and so maybe she'll behave. But she really, no matter where she is, she kind of seeks out and finds the oppressed and begins working with them and on their behalf. Her first sabbatical that she takes from teaching kind of after school is to go and work in a factory. So this, again, I think about her philosophy as you sit, you think, you write, and then you go out and you see what that looks like in the world. Are these ideas actually the way that it is? So at that stage, she's very Marxist in the way that she's seeing the world. So she wants to see, well, what is it actually like to work in the factory? Her time in the factories is pretty horrific for her. I mean, working in factories generally, for anyone who's had to do that work, it can be really difficult. It's particularly difficult for her because she's very nearsighted. She's very slow at doing the work. And she nearly has a breakdown while she's in the factory. She realizes too that indeed her philosophy was wrong, that she needs to rethink it, because the position that she's put in when she's working there, she just thinks, no, there's no way we can ask that I would be ready to have a revolution from here. She's exhausted, she's degraded, she's lost her subjectivity through this. So she then, she does 3 different kind of times working in this automotive factory. And then her next, I guess, sabbatical, we could say, from teaching, she goes to fight in the Spanish Civil War. So, and again, she's really not the person you would necessarily want to be fighting with. She's nearsighted. She's kind of notoriously clumsy. And so she ends up getting in through pretending that she's a journalist to get kind of a press pack, and she joined this anarchist brigade. And she, unfortunately, again, with her nearsightedness, steps into a pot of oil, hot oil that was meant for cooking. And so she's sent away within the month So she has to leave to be treated. Within the month, all of her brigade is actually wiped out. So they're all killed in battle. So she is, in a sense, lucky that she stepped in that pot of boiling oil. Um, at this point is when we kind of move into what we could think of as her spiritual turn. So she has been pretty radically concerned with oppression, concerned with class structure. And then it's during kind of one of these retreats away from the factory work where she's really trying to put herself back together. She's in Portugal, and this is something to note as well, which it is an important aspect of Vey, that her parents are always right there to kind of swoop in and help her when she needs. So as much as I think it's extremely admirable to really go and do the things and see, well, what does it look like to work in a factory? What does it look like to fight in the war for, what you believe in? She also does always have that cushion or that protection there with the kind of love and money of her parents. But so she's in Portugal and recovering, and she hears the locals in this little fishing village coming down, singing in the streets. And she says she just connects to them so deeply and has this understanding in this moment that Christianity is a religion for, she says, slaves or for the wretched. And she really feels herself as one with that group. A couple years later, she's in Assisi, and she has another experience where she just kind of is overcome and falls to her knees to pray. She's just compelled to prayer. And then the third one is she's in the south of France at a monastery, and she's dealing with these terrible migraine headaches that have kind of plagued her for her whole life. As she's dealing with this headache, she's been reciting this poem by George Herbert, Love, and she's reciting it over and over and over again. And suddenly she kind of steps out of her body and has this experience where she says she meets Jesus, that she has this full religious experience of God. And I would say these don't radically change her philosophy. It's not as if she was a political philosopher, now she's a mystic. And that's a very common and unfortunate, I think, reading of her work, because instead what it gives is a depth, a spiritual depth to the same work that she's been doing before. So at this point, 1940, the Nazis come in, take over Paris. So Vey and her family escape to Marseille, and from Marseille to Casablanca, and then over to New York, with the exception of her brother, who is at that point in a prison camp. He does later get over to America as well. And his name, Andre Vey, he is a world famous mathematician. But Vey doesn't want to stay so far away. She wants to be over there working. So she manages to get back to the UK to work for the Free French in the UK, kind of under de Gaulle. At this point, this is when she writes her book, The Need for Roots, a project given her by the Free French. I don't think that's what they were looking for, this philosophical treatise, but that's what they got. And during this time, kind of her lifelong illness gets increasingly worse. She comes down with tuberculosis, and the only cure for tuberculosis at that time is bed rest and high nutrition. And she continues to refuse nutrition beyond what the soldiers are getting. And so with that, she becomes more and more ill, and she dies at the age of 34 in a sanitarium in Ashford in Kent in the UK. So the main moments of her brief but very intense life.
Well, I couldn't ask for a better kind of biopic of her life. You took us through, the moments of her youth, all the way into her adolescence, and then finally into her activism. Um, so I can't thank you enough for that kind of very rich and robust biography on her life, which I think is great. And you also really um, give myself and the viewers a lot more. They say you can't see one side of the moon. You've given us a kind of full depth of Vey, which I really appreciate. You brought up some influences and some thinkers, and so this leads me to my next question. In your opinion, who were Vey's most important philosophical influences, and how do you see these influences being employed throughout her work?
Thank you. That's a great question. For for Bay, I think the main character that's always there in the background, I think, very much comes from Alain, her teacher, in his reading, but is Plato. I would say to anyone who thinks they is a Christian thinker, I usually respond that she's a Platonist more than she's a Christian. Plato is really at the heart of what she's doing, in my opinion. I guess I'll highlight a couple of the major um, Platonic ideas within her thought. One of them is a pedagogy of Socratic wisdom. She really believes that the greatest knowledge we can attain is the recognition that we're mediocre, that we can always learn more, that we should always be open and thinking to what we don't know, really trying to determine that which is beyond our grasp. And she has a marvelous essay on the right use of school studies with a view to the love of God, where she talks about this and how we need to use our studies to realize that, you know, we're not as smart as we think we are. And the way we can attain true wisdom is through taking all of the knowledge, the facts that we have, letting those exist kind of at a lower level, and then being open, being available to what is real. Because when we know the truth of everything, then we miss reality. We miss actually seeing what's there. So this, I think she very much takes from Plato. Another important aspect of her political philosophy that she takes from Plato is the concept of the great beast, the kind of social political collective that they really wants to push back against. So this, of course, comes from Plato's Republic. And she sets up this idea that anytime we join a collective, the collective asks us to stop thinking. So she says every political party always put forward that they're educating those who join their party. And she says, well, not really. Actually, what you're doing is you're asking them not to think. You are precisely saying, no, you don't think. We have this, you have to toe the party line is what you have to do. So, and she says, you get into this place of saying, well, as a socialist or as a communist, I believe this and this. And so you have these kind of pre-made answers to every question, and being a part of the party asks you not to think specifically. So with this in mind, she obviously has a very pessimistic view of politics. So you can think about it as opposed to Hannah Arendt, who talks about totalitarianism as being something going wrong within the political system. For they, totalitarianism is the end for every political party. That is the system working as it should. And this is why we have to be very, very cautious and conscientious of joining collectives. At the end of the day, she, I think, is more of a reformist than necessarily a revolutionary. but she does, I think, take a lot from Plato in her worries about collectivity, in worries about how much philosophy, critical thinking might actually be really contrary to politics. I think the most important aspect of Platonism that Weil takes up is the idea of the metaxia, or kind of this bridges is one way to think about it, of the bridges between us human creatures and God, or between the universal and the particulars. And so this she takes predominantly from Plato's Symposium, but this idea of always moving towards that which is more. So using these moments of bridges that we can cross over towards the good, towards love. And I actually have a quote from her notebooks about this that I was hoping to read. And this is on page 370 from her notebooks. So it says, "The bridges of the Greeks, we have inherited them, but we do not know what use to make of them. We have imagined that they were for building houses upon, so we have erected skyscrapers thereon, to which are continually adding fresh stories. We do not realize that they are bridges, things made to cross over, and that they are on the way leading to God." So she has this strong sense of the Greeks being, in Plato in particular, offering these ways that we can kind of access God, access the universal. And this is oftentimes in kind of interpretation of Plato, you can have your fully ironic, you're always in this Socratic dialogue, you can never actually get to any truth, or you have the dogmatic reading of Plato, where you can actually access the form of, and you can have these absolute truths. And that dogmatic reading of Plato is where we have this divide of kind of the higher forms, the good, from the material world, and this kind of rejection of the material world. And Weil doesn't really want either of those. What she wants is for us to have these bridges, this kind of movement in between, back and forth between this world in which we live, infused with the divine love, the good, the ethical, that which is kind of beyond, the thoughtful, and we bring it into the world. It deepens our understanding of the world rather than leaving it behind. And she's not alone in this, you can say, metaxological reading of Plato. There's other thinkers. Catherine Pickstock has a really wonderful kind of doxological reading, kind of the praise of the divine, of the is what Plato's all about, or Ferrari, Jennifer Rapp. There are others that give this type of reading of Plato. I do think this is very, very influential in her work. And it allows us to have a Plato that doesn't reject the body. So beyond Plato, because I could just keep talking about Plato forever. But instead I'll say she also has, I mean, you go through her notebooks and she's influenced by so many people. Within, one paragraph, she will talk about the Bible, the Bhagavad Gita, speaking of mythology, speaking of and all kinds of different mythology too. So of course there's Greeks, kind of Greek mythology, but then she'll also be like this Norse myth. She'll talk about Inuit myth. She's really drawing from everywhere. Spinoza is a major influence. She speaks about the Pythagoreans a lot. They're really important for her. She has a wonderful essay called The Pythagorean Doctrine. Greek tragedy, she really embodies in a lot of ways, I think, the figure of Antigone, to the extent that her picture is featured kind of on the cover of a recent edition of Antigone because she's just, I think she embodies that so much. And then of course Marx, and I also mentioned Descartes. So as any great philosopher, she's just drawing from everywhere that she can.
I think you did a wonderful job of you really kind of fleshing out all of these influences. I really enjoyed the reading of Plato that she has and that you did so nicely to disclose for all of us. Um, I, I I think that's great. It sounds like she's got such a great eclectic collection of all of these wonderful thinkers. And of course, bringing them all together and still having her own unique reading is just really wonderful. Now, you had brought this up before about her kind of ethical, political nature. So, does they have a kind of distinct philosophical ethics? And do you see an ethical tension in her work between the natural and the supernatural?
Yes, thank you. So to me, her ethics are definitely what drew me into her work, among other things. But so she has, I would say, her ethics begins in attention, in cultivating, attending to the world. And as we begin to actually pay attention in this way that I spoke of, that it's not a like I'm not trying to think really hard and grab onto things. It's this openness. It is I could say passive, but that's not quite right. It is receptive. And she says it's one of the most difficult things to do, to be actively attentive without totalizing, to just be able to be open to the truth. So this cultivation of attention, which she really beautifully sets out how to do that in her writings, which is also so nice. So she gives us this, how it is that we can pay attention to the world. And as we pay attention to the world, there is a recognition of the other, and particularly the oppression of the other, that really comes to the forefront as you are attending to the world. And in this, for her, the whole point of school studies, it's not about getting a good grade. And it's also not about even getting to this point where you can truly love God in the way that she thinks you can through attention. It's about actually being ethical. To her, she says it's about being able to see someone who is going through a really difficult thing and ask them, what are you going through? To be able to be present for that person, genuinely ask them how they're doing, and then be able to act to respond in kind. So this moment of being present for the other begins her process of decreation, which is what is kind of adapted in the later writings of Iris Murdoch as kind of this unselfing process. So I see the other, I allow the other to exist. I kind of retract myself so that they can be there. But then I reassert myself and I act on behalf and with the other. Once I've asked them, what are you going through? And I've really heard them, then I act. So in this, she gives the example of the Good Samaritan is one of her ways of thinking about this. So everyone else who's passing by on the road just goes directly by this person who is lying near dead at the side of the road. And it's the Samaritan who stops, who pays attention. And to Vey, this is a miracle because the Samaritan has seen that which was invisible, has given subjectivity to something that to everyone else was purely an object, has retracted themselves in order that the other can come into being, but then has to act, has to go to this person to help them, to ask them, to lift them up. So she says, it's almost a miracle. It is a miracle. This kind of, it has to be something which is incredibly difficult for us to do, but possible. So we have this, in a sense, death of the ego self and a replacement of the self in relation to the other. So is there within Weil's ethics a tension between the natural and the supernatural? Yes, there is. This tension, I think, speaks to precisely what Weil is about, which is a certain type of agonism, that you're always kind of this, the metaxia, the moving back and forth. You are always, one moment you're in the natural, you have this transcendence to the supernatural, then you bring it back to the natural. So it's kind of this back and forth movement, which is what I think gets Weil in trouble in some of her writings, because if you take, and we do have, I guess, just her notebooks and things that you can just take one chunk of her writing, and it may seem like there is a rejection of the natural within that moment of the material, and I would say certainly a lot of that happens, particularly when she's writing about things that are more spiritual in nature. There seems to be a rejection of matter or a rejection of the body, these types of things. However, for her, it is incredibly important that this act of decreation is not destruction. And she says this over and over again. It's not suicide. There's nothing in this act of decreating the self that is about destruction. It's something radically different that she's trying to do there. It helps to think about this within the structure of the concept of force that she sets out. So force, it probably best explained in her beautiful essay on the Iliad. It's a drive in essentially everything. It is a drive for power. And essentially, when we are not thinking, when we are not stepping back, having this moment of attention and openness, we just follow force. We just move with, where is it that the power is? Where is it in? And it doesn't necessarily have to be this incredibly aggressive thing. It can just be, I am hungry and here is food. I want this thing. It's just this, the movement of energy in the world. And for they, the miracle happens when we're able to step back and not just be pushed by force, instead to actually reflect and say, is this something that I want to do? And to have force and to not use it against another person, that's an encounter with the divine for they. This is the moment that we really have this possibility to step into the ethical, to be something more, to really experience the divine on a higher level in that moment when I have force and I choose not to use it.
Thank you very much for the kind of very, very rich answer you just gave us about her ethics and that tension between the natural and the supernatural. So, your first book is titled Decreation for the Anthropocene. Could you perhaps discuss what the concept of decreation is and how Weil uses it in her philosophy? And maybe, as a second part of the question, could you maybe elaborate on your thesis on that book?
Yes, absolutely. So I did just give a brief idea of the ethical kind of imperatives of decreation, but I think it is important to step back and first think about decreation as cosmological, because that's the first place that it's happening for Weil. So in Weil's very strange, unorthodox view of Christianity, she has or we could just say theology, perhaps. She has this idea of the creation of the universe actually being a decreation. So God is everything. God retracts itself in order that we can exist. So this retraction of the self is the universe. So in this sense, we have kind of everything that is, God is absent from. God has retracted out of. And that act of love has made us able to be, to be able to be ourselves, to have, our own freedom within the world. So that's kind of the first. And then we can see how this second ethical version of decreation is mimetic. It's us doing what God did. It is us saying, I've been given this human personality and I see someone there who hasn't. I retract myself. I step back in order that I can see the world from their perspective, in order that the world can become more full, richer, because I can then see not just from my perspective, but now from the perspective of the other. And again, I think it is really important to think about this act as a twofold process. So first, renouncing the self as the ego self, but then reasserting the self as relational. And if you don't have that second move into action, then it's just destruction. You aren't actually going through with the decreative process. And this is, I think, a very common misreading of Weil, is that people see this first moment of decreation. They think it's a self-annihilation. They think that it's asking the I to not exist at all. And that's not how I read it. That's not how a lot of thinkers that I know kind of within the academic Weil community, that's not how they see that process happening. So we could say decreation is the first step, and then there is the recreation. I include within my concept of decreation, I include the recreation within the concept, because when you don't have that additional aspect to it, it is just a destruction. My book, Ecological Ethics and the Philosophy of Simone Weil, within that text, I really try to expand Weil's process of decreation to the more than human world. Now, what does it mean to have a duty and a responsibility to not just other humans, but the surrounding natural world? And this process, to kind of assert this within Simone Weil, isn't quite right. For Weil, this is very much something that belongs to humans. And I think that there is a really important ethical imperative to that, particularly thinking through some very well-meaning environmental ethics or ecological ethics. Weil's philosophy is a really great way to allow for this expansion, but also have kind of the social political implications. When I get to the stage of my book that I do expand out her decreation, it then to me becomes a Weilian inspired project rather than Weil herself, because I think particularly for her time and place, it really is very important that the project is for the human. And I think in our particular time and place, the Anthropocene, this moment of recognition that we as human beings have fundamentally changed the planet, it's really important for us to begin to see these kinds of interconnections and to be able to think through a way to be in this world that has quite a lot of death, quite a lot of loss, extinction, but we still need to be able to see the beauty. We still need to be able to see the hope. So thinkers that really inspired me to go forward with this work would be people like Jan Zwicky, also Simone Kopfa, really wonderful thinkers who work with Weil and also with ecological ethics. Um, and I really saw a lot of possibility within Weil's work, and I think particularly in kind of continental philosophy, environmental ethics, people will bring in Levinas, they'll bring in Heidegger. You never hear them bring in Simone Weil. And I think it's such a loss to that way of thinking because she's so rich in the ways that she could be engaged with in ecological ethics, but in a lot of different ethical arenas. And for various reasons, her work just hasn't been taken up in the way that I think it should be. So this is kind of my attempt to bring that work forward, as well as ecologically. My hope is that then that can also expand out into multiple applied ethical structures that she, I think, is really, really relevant for.
So, your project, your research with Vey sounds incredibly inspiring, and I can't wait to get into it. My final question for you is, how can we describe Vey's relation with religion and with God? And does this turn towards the supernatural lead to Vey embracing a form of mysticism? Now, I just want to step back for a second. The only reason why I'm bringing up mysticism and I'm bringing this up is for you to have a kind of chance to elaborate on her religious relation with God so we can clean up maybe that definition of they as a mystic in a sense.
Yes, and thank you for that caveat, because I do think there's a lot of weaponized words in philosophy that I never realized were weaponized. Oh yes, wonderful, she's a mystic. Absolutely, yes. And there are these ways that we take certain thinkers seriously and ways that we dismiss them. And I think it's really important to be aware of that, and to think through why that is, because is Vey a mystic? I would say in a lot of ways, yes, she is. But I don't see that as a problem or exclusive to her political philosophy, her incredibly rigorous rational thinking is also happening, right? That the two can both be happening at the same time. Thinking back to your last question, decreation, and this concept that actually God is absent from the world. God is not here. So how is it for they that we experience God in this world in which God is absent? So I think really beautifully she speaks about God as becoming present in his absence, in the way that if you have loved someone who's died, they become present in and through their absence. So you see, a piece of art that maybe you both really loved, that person becomes present through their absence. And that, so it is a painful presence, but it is a presence nonetheless. And Vey says that if you want to protect the soul from wounds, you need to love something other than God. So she has this very intense relationship with the divine in that way, that God is present. She also gives us the idea of prisoners that have this wall between them. So the wall divides them and keeps them apart, but they can knock on the wall to communicate. And in this way, the wall also connects them. It also allows for this communication between the two. So we have this ability to access God through what she calls the implicit love of God in the world. So there are three main ways. The first one is love of the neighbor. So, and this is to see the divine in and through the neighbor. So the example of the Good Samaritan would be one way to think about that. She also, and I guess a more personal level, she has the love of friendship, the love of other people in our lives that This one I think is the love of the neighbor is difficult. It costs everything to allow for the other to exist in that moment when they're in absolute affliction. Friendship, I think, is this joyful love of God. And then she says the beauty of the earth is another way. And this was one of my, when I had first started reading Weil, kind of tapping into, oh, maybe there is something here that I could do, some sort of ecological ethics. But she very much sees our recognition of the beauty of the earth as kind of the fingerprints of God. And so in this, I think too, there, all of us have at one point or another had, to one degree or another, this experience of natural beauty, and really seeing something more or something greater than ourselves within that beauty, feeling very small as you stand before this magnificent earth that we live on. And for her, this is a way, a form of tapping into God. And then the last is religious rights. And so within this, I think it's important to see not just, because of course there are the kind of specific rights of, say, for example, the Catholic Church, and these moments that she really tapped into kind of in her own life. There's also, dancing. I can think of, like we could say religious dancing, something like Sufism. We can think of all of these beautiful ways of dancing, but then there is something more. I think even for the more atheistic inclined person, there's just going out and dancing where you just lose yourself in a way. And the same thing with chanting or concerts, when you go and see your favorite musician and you just lose yourself into the music. There is a lot of this. I think these are all ways that we can tap into. You can say these are forms of métexia. These are forms that we can bridge over to the supernatural, to God, this higher universal. So she sees all of these in the world as these access points to the divine. But again, it's not as if you then have an audience with God. Basically, you're knocking on the wall. This is what you get. So is Vey a mystic? I would say yes. She has a very mystical side to her work, but it's not at the expense of political. And it comes after, I would say she has the ethical, the epistemic, and then the mystical. But those three are all connected very closely for her also. So it is in acting ethically in the world, you are seeking the truth, right? And you're paying attention to the other. You really just want to know the world as it really is, not just how you want it to be or you're imagining it to be. You really want to know the truth of the world and participate in that world and act ethically, because as the world is co-created with the other, you don't want that other who's co-creating the very world that you live in to be oppressed, you want to be able to lift them up. So, and within that, then kind of in and through this action, you experience the divine. So it is a mysticism, but it's a mysticism embedded in epistemology. It's a mysticism that's embedded in ethics, I think, first and foremost. Do you mind if I share some book recommendations for?
Oh, I think that would be awesome. Like where could where could we start with they? Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I kind of piled up a few They books, because I find this is the number one thing I get asked, because she didn't write a lot of full books. So it kind of depends on what you're interested in. But I would say if you are intrigued in kind of her spiritual autobiography and concepts of attention, her book, Waiting for God, would be a great place to start. If you're more inclined towards her political work, Her book on the abolition of political parties is wonderful. It's a short essay. It's a nice kind of inroad. My personal favorite, again, if you're into Plato, Intimations of Christianity Among the Ancient Greeks. I don't think that there is a current publication of this, but it is pretty easy to find online. There's a wonderful new version of The Need for Roots that is translated, edited by Kate Kirkpatrick. And then there's a lot of really wonderful kind of commentary on that. So Eric Springstead and Ronald Collins do a great kind of companion piece to The Need for Roots if you're going through and you're kind of struggling with it. The late, great Jane Doring has a wonderful book on Simone Weil and the Spectre of Self-Perpetuating Force. That's an excellent book. Cynthia Wallace, if you're looking for literary takes on Weil, because there is this wonderful literary vein of her thought. So Cynthia's book on the literary afterlives of Simone Weil. Ben Davis has a wonderful book on kind of Simone Weil's political philosophy, Notes from the Margins. Lisa McCullough on Weil's philosophy of religion. And then for any real Weil heads, there's a new basic writings edited by Levy and Barbaras. So those are a lot, but I wanted to kind of give, because there's so many different areas of her work that you can kind of jump into, and it's going to depend on what you're interested in. And I'll also say that anyone who wants to send me an email or ask me more questions about Weil, I'm always very happy to talk about suggestions or where to go with reading her work. So,
Oh, that's excellent. I will put that down in the I'll put that down in the write-up for the video for the episode. So once again, thank you so much for all of this. You've gone above and beyond, actually.
My pleasure. Thank you. You have gone above and beyond. It's really such a pleasure to get to partake in this conversation with you.
Thank you again, Dr. Lawson.